Perfect. Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Thanks for joining to our Real Estate Live session. I have the pleasure of hosting today Doug Huberman. Doug was actually in one of our sessions not long ago, on our Friday calls, and he shared his amazing story and share, his multiple hats in our industry. Doug is a real estate entrepreneur, long-time entrepreneur, and he is also a professor of economics, and he brings a whole different perspective to what's happening, and some different reasons, and whatever it is that you're going to share with us, Doug.
Got it. Well, are we ready to go?
Yeah, the screen is yours. You can share the screen and tell us a bit more about yourself. Those who missed the last session. And take it from there.
All right, perfect. Give me 1 second to get screen share on. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, so Meny asked me to do essentially a short class on essentially economics, inflation, interest rates, and more importantly, given your careers, what effect that has on residential real estate values. Another alternate name for what I want to do today is what you need to know, because you have to plan your career in changing economic conditions, but also what your clients need to know. In other words, if they're going to rely on you and trust you with their most precious assets, they're going to want to know that you can intelligently discuss what's going on in the world and how it's likely to affect them, and wisely advise them on what their next moves should be. Who am I? Just real quick. I am a confirmed real estate junkie. I was in academia at the time that the Tax Reform Act hit, that destroyed the savings and loan industry and caused massive real estate foreclosures. So I came at this from an academic fascination. And then I had to look myself in the mirror and decide, why am I talking about this? I should be doing this. So I have 3 real estate companies. I have RVM Associates that directly invests and buys value-added rental properties. So if you have anything, please let me know afterwards. We have AMCS, which is Asset Management Consulting Services, which does turnaround consulting. We have fixed, broken real estate projects all around the country, most recently in Atlanta, San Antonio, and Phoenix. And we do asset management, where we actually sit in as a virtual owner, and we hire and fire the leasing brokers, the property managers, and we get a problem property turned around. And then the one that you're probably most familiar with is Lexington, because it only is a local company, and it manages residential real estate, everything from single family homes to apartment buildings, but really from San Dimas to Santa Barbara, and from the west side, LA, down as far south as LAX, and then up to, let's say, Valencia. So that's our wheelhouse, because what's important in property management is you have to be able to respond timely. We're looking to buy actually a property management company, if we can, in the Long Beach or South Bay area, so we can extend our range. Before real estate, as Meny said, I was a professor of economics at the University of Colorado and at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I have to say it's really tough when your average student is a valedictorian who lettered in 2 sports. But the big upside there was comparing the two is every student at University of Colorado wanted to be in the class, and every student at the Air Force Academy had to be in the class. But it was an incredible experience seeing the contrast of the two. And then before that, I flew F-111s, and I was very fortunate enough to be a Top Gun. Being in the military really, I guess, impressed on me the importance of service and giving back. And the 3 nonprofits that I'm involved with, I'm most proud of, are the Colorado Ski School for the Blind, the Levitt Pavilion for the Performing Arts, which is the 2nd biggest free concert series in the country, and the work that we do with Diavolo, where we run homeless, drug-addicted vets suffering from PTSD through the exact same program that we run the professional dancers through. And what we found is it's the most effective program in the United States, or actually probably in the world, at treating PTSD. We have about a 94% cure rate, and that compares to the VA with counseling and drugs at about 30%. So not that you should support any one of these, but I do think it's important to find those things that speak to your heart and your experience and to support and give back. So here we are with, I guess, the main question, which is we can't discuss economic issues without knowing what economics is. And you guys can all, is there a way to allow hot mic? I'd like to know what anybody out there thinks economics is.
And yeah, I mean, whoever's on the call, the Zoom, just you can unmute yourself or type on the chat.
Yeah, just unmute and shout it out.
Yeah, anybody here? Economics means what? Supply and demand. Anything else? Okay.
GNP.
Well, that's a measure of, gross national product. All right, so let's talk about that. What is economics? It is just, plain and simple, the study of human behavior when confronted with limited resources. If there was an infinite amount of everything, there would be no economics, because there'd be no need to trade a little of this for that. There'd be no need to prioritize, right? So that is the heart of what economics is. It's a behavioral science focused on human behavior when there are limited resources, and that can be monetary, it can be commodity based, it can be time, it can be lifespan. What do we do and how do we change what we do when we're confronted by those limitations? And the most common thing that most people know, in fact, I think it was said, is the supply and demand curves. And those have to do with exactly what happens when the price of a good, goes up or it gets cheaper to manufacture it. This little baby here, costs what, 1/10 of what it would have cost 10 years ago. So there's constantly changing in what tastes and preferences are, which are on the demand side, and supply, which means at any given price, how much of something will be manufactured. Now, how did we get here? Well, Adam Smith was to economics what Sir Isaac Newton was to physics. Now, I am pretty sure everybody knows gravity existed before Isaac Newton. So he didn't discover physics. What he did was he codified it. He took what he observed in the real world, and the story is the apple hit him on the head, and he started thinking, I wonder what the gravity is of this situation. All right, and then he came up with the laws. Does anybody know Newton's laws of motion?
So again,
I said, does anybody know Newton's laws or any of them?
What goes up must come down.
Okay, well, that's probably one way of saying it. Yeah, but a body at rest stays at rest. A body in motion, right, wants to stay in motion. What goes up has to come down. That's specifically gravity. All right, all he did was use what he observed that everybody who had lived up until that date had observed, and he started codifying it and describing it in a way that you could study it. That's exactly what Adam Smith did to economics. He had a book called The Wealth of Nations, and in that he codified economics. The other thing that he identified is that economics and physics have the exact same math, which is probably why it drove a lot of people crazy if you took advanced economics, because you're like, I didn't want to be a physicist, because what is it? It's calculus and it's vector analysis, right? When you launch a rocket, right, you've got thrust, that's an up vector. You've got gravity as a down vector, right? You've got friction, all right, which is slowing down the rocket. So you've got these up vectors and down vectors, and whether it successfully launches or not depends on if the up vector is bigger than the down vector or vice versa. The economy is exactly the same thing. At all times, there are vectors pointing up and down, and the economic result depends on which are stronger. Adam Smith was also the first person to use the term political economy. And why is that important? It's important because economics, unlike any other science, has huge and powerful political implications. And he knew explicitly that those that are in power and those that want power would try to lie and obfuscate for their own purposes. It's the first science to come out that virtually every power that be has the incentive to pretend it doesn't exist. All right, and I apologize for how long this slide is, But this is the essence of economics as opposed to what you see on the TV when you're watching the evening news. Okay, political economy belongs to no nation. It is of no country. It is the science of the rules of production, the accumulation, distribution, and consumption of wealth. It will assert itself whether you wish it or not. It is founded on the attributes of the human mind, and no power on earth can change it. It is not merely an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, but a body of necessary and universal truth founded on invariable laws of nature and deducted from the constitution of the human mind. And what that means is the laws of economics are just as strong as the laws of physics, but they're laws based on the way we're wired. Economics would not exist if there were not human beings. All right, so that brings us to, what is an economist? All right, it's a student of human behavior in a specific circumstance. And the point I want to make is you are an economist. All right, your entire life to this date has been spent making economic decisions, right? You have limited resources. We all do. All right, and so you're trying to decide how to best spend your time, how to best spend your resources, the trade-offs between education, investing in your business, and leisure. All right, so you've been through, I don't know how many of you have been in real estate for more than a decade, but if you've been in at least 15 years, you've already been through a cycle. So you've seen the effects that illiquidity, credit crunches, higher interest rates, you've seen the effects that all of those can have on a real estate market. And so my point to you is, you need to believe yourself, and you need to understand every human being who's watching what's going on around them is effectively an economist. And if you don't believe me, I'm willing to bet every single one of you knows all of these sayings. And every single one of them is rooted in an economic theory or law, right? Buy low, sell high. By the way, when and if there is a crash in an aspect of the real estate market, guess what? Those people who are investors will be buying low to sell high. That's why they're storing up liquidity right now. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Why? Because there's limited resources. Now, there is getting someone else to pay for it. All right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. All right? All of these sayings, which are a common part of our vernacular, are reaffirmations that you know every bit as much about economics, perhaps not the advanced mathematics, but as the person who is called an economist when you're watching the TV. And I think Richard Pryor said it best, it applies to all aspects of life. Who are you going to believe, right? Me or your lying eyes? I want you to believe your eyes. If you see an economist speaking, no matter what the venue is, if it disagrees with your personal experience, it's political. It's not economics, and that's why it's called political economy. So why is economics so seemingly contradictory? There's a lack of accountability with economics. Have you ever seen somebody brought onto the news and they say, this is Dr. So-and-so, from the Hoover Institute, and he's going to talk about inflation, right? They never say, this is so-and-so from the Hoover Institute. We've interviewed him 23 times and he's been right twice. Or they never say, we've interviewed him 23 times and he's been right 21. Well, if there's no accountability, then it's all storytelling. It's all posturing for grants, for pats on the back, invitations to the right cocktail parties, right? So you have to be very cautious. If what you're hearing sets right with your experience, it's probably right. And if it contradicts it, it's almost certainly wrong. Just to illustrate this, Milton Friedman and James Tobin both won the Nobel Prize for Economics. And the most important thing about the two of them is they disagree about absolutely everything. So what that tells you is that even the Nobel Prize for Economics is given based on status and something other than being right. All right, so let's dig straight into inflation, because that's the engine that's driving everything you're seeing right now. There's three major causes for inflation. One is expansionary fiscal policy. Those are big words. Does anybody know what that means? Anybody? Okay, it just means that the government is spending more money than it's taking in. It's deficit spending. All right, that drives inflation. Milton Friedman said, too much money chasing too few goods. Expansionary monetary policy, that's essentially the Fed or Federal Reserve pumping money into the system. And how does it do it? It can do it via low interest rates, increased money supply, actually directly putting money in, and through controlling bank reserve requirements. They control, if you have $1 billion bank, how much you have to have sitting around for emergencies and how much you can lend out and push into the system. And then the other is supply shocks. I'm old enough to remember OPEC 1 and OPEC 2. And when you have a supply shock and you drive the price of commodities up, that causes inflation as well. So let's take a quick look at what we have and what we don't have. All right. Have we had historically expansionary fiscal policy? The answer is absolutely. And I don't know if you can see my mouse, but since about 1982, that is when the dam broke and we pretty much went down the road of nonstop expansionary fiscal policy in our country. Do we currently have expansionary fiscal policy? And what this shows is the cumulative budget starting in 2017. So the actual number, we're at 32 trillion right now. But what you can see is every year up until now, and every year forecast, the deficit is going to get bigger and substantially so. And why is it they already know that in 23, 24, 25, and 26, the deficit's going to get so much bigger? It's because the emergency COVID acts, the infrastructure bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act all pour trillions of dollars into the economy. And this is assuming that the budgets for the other parts of the government don't even increase, which we know that they will. So the answer is yes, we currently have expansionary fiscal policy. Right? Do we have low interest rates? This is really important because everybody's going, oh my God, these interest rates are so high. All right. But what you can see is since about 2008, or maybe even going back a little further to maybe 2002, we have been in an era of low interest rates, and those drive economic growth. And if you have too much money, they drive inflation. And what you can see, I don't know if you can see all the way on the far right, is the steep increase in interest rates. But you can see we've increased to a range that is still historically low. So while we have increasing interest rates, we still have low interest rates. And going back to my days of flying, it's like if you're at 100 feet and climbing, yes, you're still low, and that's the situation that we're in. And I know it's a shock and I know it hurts, but 7 only feels high because we're coming from 3. Do we have an increased money supply? The best way to measure what's going into the money supply is to look at the Federal Reserve and their purchases of bonds. And what you can see here is that since 2020, the Federal Reserve has purchased about $4.5 trillion of bonds. And what that means, to buy the bonds, a bank, a person, or a country gives them a bond and they give them money. And that is just literally a fire hose of money going into the economy. We've never seen that much cash go into the economy in this short a time. You don't have to read all of this, but just so you know that up until this summer, the Federal Reserve was putting $120 billion a month of cash into the economy by buying treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. So do we have low reserve requirements? And by the way, I'm starting to feel like, what was that, the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the economics class? So, I hopefully somebody will rescue me here. The reserve requirements typically been between 2 and 10%, which means a bank had to keep 2 or 10% of its net worth in cash just sitting there. Does anybody know what the reserve requirement is today?
Want to guess?
1%.
1%?
1% would be a good guess because the answer is 0%.
Close.
For the first time in our country's history, banks are not required to have any reserves. So what does that mean? Every penny they have, they're pushing it out. Because how do they make money? They make loans. All right. The other thing that the reserve requirement does, the higher the reserve requirement, the more they need cash, right? How can they get cash if they have all their money loaned out? They typically sell off their REO. With the zero reserve requirement, banks have absolutely zero incentive to sell their REO. And that's why you see so few foreclosure sales and so few REO sales right now. All right. The last thing, which is the only part of this that is not under direct government control, i.e. a policy of the Fed or a policy coming from the executive branch, is supply shocks. And the thing you need to understand is supply shocks are not all created equal. If there's a sudden frost and the entire US orange crop is destroyed, yes, the price of orange juice is going to go way up and the price of mimosas is going to go up. But beyond that, there's going to be virtually no effect in the whole economy. But energy and fertilizer are a completely different story. And why is that? Think about energy. One, we consume it directly, right? Heating our vehicles. Two, it's used in the manufacture of goods, plastics, a lot of biomedical products, even face lotions, gels. They're all from petroleum products, right? So that ripples through the entire economy because virtually every good is transported, just that one alone. And then think of fertilizer. It affects every foodstuff. And you say, well, that should only affect crops. The problem is it affects crops directly, but then it also affects the crops that are used for feed. And then it affects cattle, pork, chicken, and every edible good that consumes feed. So those two, energy and fertilizer, whenever you see supply shocks in those sectors, you know you're in for a long spate of inflation because it takes, remember, months for these things to work themselves through the system. Even if you set everything right today, it would be between 16 and 18 months before you saw substantive results. So let's look at what's going on in the energy sector. Why are, yeah.
One question with your permission, 2 slides back about the reserves versus the, you didn't mention, you didn't mention about the relationship between the reserves and the REO. How long do you think that's going to be required or allowed for the banks not to have any kind of reserves?
I have no idea, but the one thing I will tell you is that's a news item that's a good thing for every single one of you to be following, because the minute they announce that the reserve requirements are going to be re-implemented, banks are going to start dumping their REO. So I wouldn't wait until it's announced to start making your relationships with those people who control REO at the banks. You know, it's going to happen, but nobody knows when. And the reason that nobody knows when is the political part of political economy. There's no excuse for it. There's no economic need for it. But politically, they're probably doing the calculus and saying if we reinstate the reserve requirement, there's going to be a lot of real estate dumped. We're on the edge. You know, prices are doing this. You know, do we want to risk causing a major correction in the housing market? And again, that's a thing about economics. The laws of nature don't change, but government has the ability to dilute itself into kicking the can down the road. There will be a reckoning, but it won't be until reality is faced at the Fed. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at domestic oil production, because everybody's heard on the news in the last month that we are at record levels of production. And I've heard that, you know, I channel check because I don't believe anything. So I watch all the major cable and broadcast news. And I've heard that mentioned by several top political operatives. All right, well, here's the fact of the matter. And by the way, there's the Energy Information Administration, the EIA. You can go straight to the website and you can see all of this info. All right, from 2017 until just before the pandemic, there was a huge increase in our domestic oil production. and we got up to about 13 million barrels a day. That's this range right here. When COVID hit, shutdowns dropped it, and now you can see it's been slowly increasing. But what have we increased to? We are at 1 million barrels a day less than we were before the pandemic, which is 365 million barrels a year below. But that even sounds smaller than you convert it into gallons. We are now producing 55 million gallons a day less gas than we were before the pandemic. And what are we doing with that less gas that we have? There's been a lot of news about, withdrawing gas from the petroleum reserve in order to help mitigate the price increases. And if you look at this graph, the orange is our cumulative withdrawals from the reserve. But you know what the blue is? The blue is our oil sales to China. So what we see here is that we're actually getting less oil, we're drilling for less oil, and even though we're taking out of our strategic reserves, we're exporting more than double the amount we're taking out of those reserves to just China. If you put exports to all countries, the number would be much, much bigger. All right, so what's the net effect on that? All right, well, if you're drilling less and you're exporting more than you're actually taking out of your reserves, your stocks have to fall. And why is October so important for diesel, heating, and heating oil? Because that's what you're going into the winter with. All right, your production falls during the winter, not to zero, but it does fall. So you literally build your stocks, build your stocks, build your stocks, and what you have October is a measure of what your winter is going to look like. All right, this is October, the peak here is October 2020. All right, this is October, I don't know if you can see the mouse, this is October 2021, and this is where we are now. We're going into this winter with the lowest stock of what are called distillates, which are diesel and heating oil, since records started being taken. Okay, that is by nature a supply shock. All right, so supply shocks, they have an effect on price. All right, so here you can see the price of those same distillates, and it's never stays the same. It's bouncing around. The pandemic hit. All right. By the time that President Biden was inaugurated, the price was back roughly to where it had been before the pandemic. And then this is what you see happening since. As the supplies started to be choked off and as demand returned, the price skyrocketed. Now let's look at fertilizer, because that's the other one that goes through the whole entire system. You can see it remains pretty much steady. And then all of a sudden, at the same time, you can see where the inflection point and when it started going up. And you can ask yourself, why in the world does the pricing for fertilizer track so closely with that for petroleum products? And the reason is, and I'm as surprised as anybody to find this out, is that one of the primary ingredients in fertilizer is petrochemicals. So those are individual things. Now let's look at inflation as a whole. And again, I really feel like going class. All right. Can anybody tell me what the difference is between the PPI and the CPI? Because you hear it on the news when they say the CPI, what does that mean? When they say the PPI, what does that mean?
Like consumer price index is like what people are paying for it, and then PPI is how much it's costing the manufacturers to make it.
Correct. And what you can see over time by this graph is that the two over time end up almost exactly equal. And you ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, guess what? In the long run, the cost of making goods is reflected in the cost of selling goods. Otherwise, if they can't increase, if their expenses go up, i.e. the PPI, and they can't raise prices, they go out of business. So the two have to track together by definition. So what you can see is, and again, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but what you can see is there's a major inflection point here, where all of a sudden the CPI and the PPI started going up, and that is January of 2021. And it's driven by what happened in the oil sector. And the one thing you'll notice is the PPI in the low areas When it's down below the mean, which is the horizontal line, the PPI is the lower of the two. When it's higher, the PPI is the higher of the two. So the CPI, the consumer price index, chases the producer price index. And you can see that as plain as day when you look at the historical data. So if you want to know what's happening to consumers, you can look at the CPI. If you want to know what is going to happen to consumers, you need to look at the PPI. And again, this is the type of thing when if we end up in a situation where there's a cash crunch and mortgages are unobtainable, in order to make sales, you're going to be dealing with investors, likely all cash, likely sophisticated investors. These are the types of things that are part of their everyday. And your ability to discuss this with them will help you establish your credibility. And you establish credibility in one part of your life, it gets extended to the other parts of your life. All right. Now, one of the other things that we keep hearing on the news is inflation is the result of corporate greed. Well, if that's the case, I would like someone to explain to me what President Biden did in January of 2021 that triggered corporate greed. Because the beginning of this graph, right, that's all Obama. The middle part is Trump. And then the right-hand side is under President Biden's watch. Well, why wasn't there corporate greed under Obama? Why wasn't there corporate greed under Trump? It's a nonsensical, again, remember, political economy. When you hear things that are contrary to what you're seeing, i.e. you go to the gas station, you go to the grocery store, it can't be that every manufacturer of every good spontaneously became greedy the minute President Biden got sworn in. There was something else going on. And we've already discussed, we had expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy, and a supply shock. And I don't know if anybody knows this, I did my doctoral prelims in economic history. And going back as far as I've studied, it's the first time in our country's history that every one of those vectors has been pointed up at the exact same time. So this is what we've seen happen in the mortgage market. What's interesting here is, remember I said, that things work themselves, you jump off a cliff, it's instantaneous feedback. In economics, it takes 6 to 18 months. Well, inflation got triggered really in earnest February, March of 2021, right? And guess what? Interest rates about a year later started going up. And people are all blaming the Fed, but in reality, they would have started going up anyway. Because think about it, if inflation is 8% and you're a lender, you're giving somebody $100, they're paying you, let's say, 3% interest, which is what mortgages were at. And when they pay you back the $100, it's only going to be worth 92. Can you do that forever? You cannot. One of the big fallacies is we lose money on every transaction, but we make it up with volume. It's unsustainable. Interest rates have to chase inflation. Now, the Fed can provide a focal point for it, but it's going to happen anyway because lenders are not, just think about it. If the inflation rate is 5% higher than the interest rate and you do a 30-year loan, the money you get paid back is almost completely worthless. So banks cannot persistently keep interest rates more than about 2% under the inflation rate. All right, so let's just do a quickie review. Right? Interest rates follow inflation, and we saw it happened in our country about 12 to 14 months later. Residential real estate goes down when interest rates go up, and real estate goes up when interest rates go down. And then the other thing we need to acknowledge is who's going to be hurt by these higher interest rates the most? It's going to be people who have interest-only mortgages who are forced to refinance. And the reason is 100% of their mortgage is interest. So if they go from 3 to 6, their mortgage doubles. They go from 3 to 7.5, their mortgage is what? Double and a half, right? What it was. So all of a sudden they have to scramble and come up with a lot more money or pay down the loan by over 50%, or they're going to lose their houses. And the other thing that you have to acknowledge about what we've discussed so far is the Fed controls interest rates and reserve requirements for banks. And by controlling that reserve requirement, they're controlling the supply of housing. Because right now banks have been sitting on their REO going, hey, it's just going up in value. Now they're holding on to it saying, well, it's pretty stable. Why should we sell it? As soon as there's a reserve requirement, they'll be forced to sell their REO, and that will change the market. Now, let's look at an individual who wants to buy a $2 million house. 7 months ago, they would have needed, and that's the far left-hand column, is it 3%? They would have needed to have an income of $270,000 a year to afford that $2 million house. Today, if you go all the way to the right, depending on, we're at 7% to 7.5%, depending on the lender, they need to have an income of pretty close to $400,000 a year to afford the same house. So the question is, are there now more or less people out there who can afford $2 million houses? Well, that's going to affect the demand. Now let's look at the maximum house price you can afford with a certain income. And don't ask me how I came up with $270,870 for the income, but working through that and keeping the same $400,000 deposit with a 3% interest rate, that person could afford a $1,740,000 house. Today, that person can only afford a $1,327,000 house. So what does that tell you? Remember, you're just as much an economist as I am or anybody on TV. Where is demand going to fall? What end of the housing market? And where is demand going to be the most stable given what we're seeing here? And remember, this is just fully amortizing loans. Now, let's look at interest only. To afford that same $2 million house, the person only needed to have an income of $168,000. Today, they need to have an income of $368,000. They need more than twice as much of an income to afford the same house. Now, I know that there's wages are increasing, but they're increasing at 4 or 5%. They're not increasing at 120% a year. And then let's look at what they can afford. That person with $250,000 a year income buying on a interest-only loan could afford a $2.8 million house. Today, it's a $1.4 million house. So again, ask yourself, given your experience in real estate and your experience in life, how is this going to affect the real estate market, and is it going to affect it evenly across the spectrum? All right, so since you're all economists, here's the questions that we need to grapple with. And again, please, as many of you as feel comfortable, unmic. I'm not hopefully as intimidating as apparently I look on the Zoom. All right. You need to answer for yourself, and I guess you don't have to answer it out loud. Is the administration making a serious effort to fight inflation? Right? Is the federal deficit falling? Not the rate of growth decreasing. Is the federal deficit falling? Well, that'll answer the question for fiscal policy. The Fed, what is it doing with interest rates? Yes, it's increasing them, but they're still low. The way to fight inflation is with high interest rates, not less low. All right. Reserve requirements at the lowest in history. All right. The only area where they're neutral, they're neither expansionary or contractionary, is bond purchases. They've pretty much stopped doing that. So they've stopped just pumping the cash, but everything else is an up vector. So we have 4 up vectors and 1 sideways. All right. Are the supply shocks we have localized, containable, or the type that are virtually everywhere and permeate the entire economy? All right. So what has happened to the supply and demand of residential housing as a result? All right. From where I sit, supply is dropping off. Why? Banks are holding their REO. Builders are stopping building. A lot of sellers are holding on, praying to God, right? The economy is going to get better. So supply is shrinking, right? And demand, all right? 2 things are happening. 1, buyers are being forced from the high end of the market. If you're super high to the high to medium high, they're being forced down the chain, right? So that's happening on the demand side. And the other thing is a lot of the big home buyers, like, the institutional ones, they're just stopped buying because they're expecting a major correction and they want to buy low, sell high, right? So we kind of answered it. What sectors of the housing market are likely to be hit the hardest? Well, you need to be thinking about that. What sectors are likely to be hit the least and why? All right. What's going to happen if the Fed restores the bank reserve requirement? We touched on that. Now, more importantly, let's make it personal. What are the implications for your business plan, for your business? Because you guys are not employees, right? Each of you runs a business. So you have the obligations of both being your best employee and being your best corporate strategist. All right. And then you got to ask yourself, who is most likely to be forced to sell their home in the coming market? And you could also add who's the most likely to buy in the coming market. So here's my list of most likely sellers. 1, probate. It used to be when people died, they could leave all of their properties pretty much to their children without an adjustment in the property taxes. Prop 19 destroyed that. So you're going to see a lot more probate sales now than you've ever seen before. Divorce, I hate to say it, it's countercyclical, which means in bad economic times, it's a booming business. It's like a short fund in a sense. So if the economy gets worse, divorces are going to increase, right? Holders of interest-only loans that can't afford to refinance. Somebody who got a 3 or 4% IO loan 5 or 7 years ago is going to have a heck of a time refinancing at current rates. You might want to be talking to your clients right now that have those types of loans and saying, hey, what's the plan? You know, how are you going to extricate yourself? Are you going to be able to pay down the loan? Can you afford the higher payment? If not, yeah, the market's a little softer, but it's likely to get worse. So if you need to sell, maybe now's the time. Here's another thing. I don't know if anybody's been watching the news. What's going on in the tech sector? They are laying off tens of thousands of employees. And many of them actually overlap with the cybercurrency fanatics. All right. A lot of the former Bitcoin and other cybercurrency millionaires or billionaires have lost 2 things. 1, they've lost a big chunk of their wealth, but they've also lost their income because they were using Bitcoin and Doge or whatever going up. That was their spending money. Well, guess what? With those values going down, that's a pool of people who have lost both income and wealth, very likely to become sellers. And then the other is lenders. If that reserve requirement gets re-implemented, you're going to see a ton of sales. All right, so Meny, this is a good time to ask, should we have time to go on to ADUs, or should we just go to Q&A on the economics?
Well, yes, for the ADUs, but any questions? I mean, that was so good, Doug. I mean, that education background, and right now instead of economy, I learned tons of new things for sure. Any questions about the kind of, the slide so far? Yes.
Yes, my question is, what causes inflation as Biden got inaugurated? You mentioned expansionary fiscal policy and then supply shock. What was the third one?
Expansionary monetary policy, the actions of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and the supply shock.
Well, the supply shocks, the major ones that concern us are the petroleum and the fertilizer, because that affects, petroleum, all goods, including food, and then fertilizer, all crops and all animal products are affected.
What was the third one?
What was the third one?
Well, no, it was expansionary fiscal, monetary, and supply shocks. The expansionary monetary has 3 things in it, and that is the reserve requirement, the interest rate, and the purchase of bonds.
And what does he think that the war in Iraq and the COVID-19 after effects, does he think that also affect inflation anywhere?
Yeah, the war, the Russian war, no doubt had an effect on exacerbating what was already a bad situation. In other words, when we go back to this slide here, you can see the inflation kicked in, starting in January, February, March of 2021 in earnest, right? The war, started this year in Russia, right? So, but let's look at how it made it worse. If we look at, let's see, where is the other way real quick. If you look at the price of fuels, all right, here, right? You can see the pandemic dropped it down. By the time Biden came into office, we were about where we were before the pandemic. You see steady growth. And we were about, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not,
Yeah.
but we were about right here when the war in Russia started. So the distance between here and where we are today, you can directly, and the spike here, you can attribute the spike here and the distance between when the war started and where we are today directly to the war in Russia, and that's about 13 cents a gallon.
Mike.
Yeah, so with the PPI report coming out better than the forecast today, obviously the general idea would be that next month's CPI could give us another confirmation of the current direction of inflation. But
correct. There's a lot of people who think we're going to stabilize somewhere in the sixes, based on, you saw that spike, from the war. So the historic numbers are around 2%. But yeah, in other words, if the PPI and the CPI are going in the same direction, that means that inflation is no longer, screaming and heading further north. It's stabilizing at some new level.
Is there anything that we might potentially want to keep an eye on that could affect next month's CPI?
The problem is the month-to-month numbers are, you really have to do a trailing average, let's say 3 to 4 month minimum average, and see how that trend line is running to have a really good feel for what's going on. It's just like when you're watching stock reports on TV, it drives me nuts. They say the market was up on blank, and they give you one piece of news. And then they say tomorrow the market was down on blank, and they give you one piece of news. You really have to look at periods of, weeks and months to see what the overall trend line is doing. It's the same thing. I don't know if anybody, unfortunately, I'm a data nerd. So for the first, 6 months of COVID, I was tracking all the daily data. And of course it was up and down. There were way less deaths on Sundays than Mondays. Well, why? Because they didn't report data on those days. So you really had to do like a 7-day trailing average to get a feel. For CPI and PPI, you really need to do at least a 3-month trailing average. And what you'll see is they went like this, they peaked, and I guess I can go back to the graph that I had. Let's see, where is that?
Maybe a minute, and then you can take us to the ADU.
Okay, so what you could see is, that both the PPI, which is the yellow line, right, and the CPI are slowly starting to settle back down. And we'll see where that goes. But again, you much rather have the PPI heading downward than upward, and you like seeing the gap between them close, because that means that whatever was aggravating it doesn't mean it's getting necessarily better, but it's not getting worse anymore. In other words, that distance between the blue and the yellow, that's how much worse it's getting, right? And then as soon as the PPI gets below the CPI, as you can see, it does in these areas here, then you'll see, steady declines. I think this might be the best and most dramatic. You see, the PPI is going up, the CPI is going up, PPI goes down, CPI goes down. So yeah, no, I think it's very safe to say the worst is over. But that doesn't mean that better is good. In other words, we've gone from 1.4% to the 8s and 9s, and now we're only at 7.7. That's almost like when you punish somebody and they start to misconstrue less punishment as a reward. All right, so let's focus on, is an ADU for you? Because this is an important thing. We have a lot of clients, and I don't know if you do, they think, oh my God, an ADU, best thing ever, right? Add income to an existing rental property, spend a little money, get a lot of rent, no brainer. In fact, I'm gonna just put as many as I possibly can. So here's the first case study. If you see the area outlined in red, this is one of our clients. And I give them tremendous credit because what they did was they built this ADU, and they put a high fence between it and the main house. And you can see the main house still has its garage. It still has a private backyard. In fact, we'll even look at the backyard. It feels completely private. So they added something and they added value without diminishing the value of that house. The problem is, and against our advice, that same client went and turned the garage into an ADU. And guess what? They can't rent the main house for a fraction of what it used to rent for. So an ADU, this is called too much of a good thing. All right. What they did was they added value by doing the first ADU, putting in a high fence, making it totally private, and then they destroyed the value of the main house by putting an ADU here. Somebody who's going to pay top dollar to rent a house wants privacy, and they want a place to park their car. All right, so now let's look at these lots here. These are all in Lake Sherwood. All right, there's one here that you could definitely build an ADU on, and it's this one here. And it's because it is a shallow but wide lot. And that's one of the things you want to look for. So you can literally split off this part of the lot and you could build another home there, a rental property, and that would work. You wouldn't be affecting the privacy, the parking, or any aspect of that main house. All right, looking here, this is also Lake Sherwood. Some of these would be good for ADUs, some would not. All right, right here, this one would work. Why? There's a road behind it, and you could build something small in the back that's totally shielded because of the trees and the topography. This lot, absolutely not. The house is in the middle. There's no place to put an ADU without destroying the privacy, right? This one here, that would work too. You've got to drive this way to a house at the bottom. There's another road. This is actually Upper Lake Road where you could access an ADU in the back. This one's the opposite. The main house is accessed from Upper Lake, but you can see there's a drive here that goes to the bottom, so you could do an ADU here. This one, no, for two reasons. The house is in the center of the lot, and there's no access. You'd have to do access from the same point as the main house and destroy its privacy to do an ADU. All right, here we go, the importance of corner lots. All right, you can see here, this corner lot has an additional structure. This corner lot has an additional structure. This corner lot, you could add one. This corner lot, you could add one. But all of the mid-block houses, because the houses almost go lot line to lot line, there's no way to do an ADU without destroying the value of the main house. Okay, the position on the lot, as we discussed, matters as much as whether it's on the corner or not. Here you can see the house is built to the front of the lot, so there's room you could do an ADU, and there's a street here and a street here, so you could access this ADU off of this street and have complete privacy. This house is built in the front, but there's no way to get to the back. So it's not, a no-brainer. And I'll skip all of these right here. And any questions about any and all of what we've discussed?
Was that amazing or what?
Yes.
Yes, question.
So regarding the PPI and CPI for a novice person, what would be a good source for me to start tracking that information?
You would just go directly to the Department of Labor website, and actually, hold on one second. I'm going to stop screen share. All right, are we back to normal here?
Just seeing your screen.
Oh, you're still seeing the screen.
Let me hold on.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay, so now we're back to a normal screen. You want to really watch, as I said, the CPI and the PPI. And I can actually find you the exact websites if you give me a second.
Sure. Think about other questions, and if you're in the Zoom, again, you either unmute yourself.
Yeah, even though I'm male, I can marginally dual task. So feel free to ask me questions while I'm looking for this web.
We got you. I mean, if you can fly one of those aircrafts, Doug, I think you can do other stuff.
Hopefully so. But by the way, you're going to go to www.bls, which stands for Bureau of Labor Statistics, .gov, and then it's either /CPI or /PPI.
Other questions? Yes.
I have one. What does he do for his clients? He mentioned he does some these ADU analysis for his clients.
Well, and actually that's a service that we provide to our clients and to our referring agents. So for example, let's just say you have a client that's looking at buying a property with the intent of putting an ADU on it, and it's going to be a rental property. Then with a lot of the agents that refer us, we'll actually get involved even before offers are made, looking at the property, looking at the site plan, and sharing with the agent what we think should or should not be done, or could not be done at that property, and whether it would increase value or diminish it. Same thing if it's an existing rental property, then once you're in escrow, we'll do things, and we'll read the leases, we'll look at the past financial statements, because when you're buying a rental property, you should always get the past years, and that's plural, of operating statements. And we'll look at the leases, we'll look at the operating statements, identify if there's any fraudulent numbers involved, and help you and your client decide if this really is the type of investment they want to make.
Yeah, I've been contacted by flippers.
Question.
Oh, sorry.
Only if you have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does he advise that we can get those traditional REOs or foreclosed government properties now that they seem non-existent anymore?
Right. The thing to do is start building relationships with the people who control REO at financial institutions. And that means not asking them for business right away, finding out who they are, finding ways to network with them, inviting them out to lunch, getting to know them, letting them know who you are and what you do, and just start building that bridge. I don't know if anybody here is a member of Provisors. It's an absolutely outstanding networking organization that has primarily lawyers, accountants, personal managers, bankers, and that's the way that I network with those types of people. Is I meet them through that. They have this thing where after a meeting, then you have these, troikas, which is where you meet for lunch or breakfast or coffee and get to know each other. And I'm a strong believer that people give business to people that they know, like, and trust. And you have to start with know before you can get to like, and you have to get to know somebody pretty good before you trust them. So I think part of everybody's business plan needs to be networking that doesn't directly lead to business. In other words, you should have networking you're doing to get a listing this week, this month, or this quarter. And you should also have networking that you're doing to build long-term relationships. Given where we're headed, long-term relationships right now with divorce attorneys, probate attorneys, and bankers who control REO are looking like really, really, really good ways and wise investments of your time.
What was the name of the organization again?
Provisors, capital PRO, capital VISORS.
That question on the chat from Chitra. Could you advise on international investments? Is the US still a good place to buy, and something in relation to the dollar value, I guess, in general?
Okay, so that's the kind of question that is the reason I brought this to the meeting.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. By the way, my favorite poison is Angel's Envy finished rye, if you ever want to bribe me. I think the problem with that type of question is nobody knows. And anybody who thinks they know is lying. It's the same thing like anybody knows what interest rates are going to be like a year or two years from now. Can't know. I can tell you what direction the factors are pushing, but I can't tell you exactly where they're going to go, because we have this, again, the political economy. The government has the ability to intervene, and what it can do is it can, paper over things. So in the short run, it mitigates the effect. You still pay the piper eventually and later, but that's the thing we don't control. We like to think we control the politicians, but in this regard, we do not. And so for me, the US is a great place to invest. Why? Because this is where I am. And if there's political instability or something really, really, really bad happens, I may not be able to get to investments, overseas. And this is coming from somebody who I have owned property in England and Germany. I do not now. And I would, personally, I'm not saying you don't, but given what's going on with Russia and given what we're seeing, with what's going on with China, and their huge investments in South America and in Southeast Asia that are going to give them just very, very strong control over those economies. I wouldn't be so fast to invest in places that, should we come to blows directly with either Russia or China, that we'll have difficult getting access to. And if they're valued in US dollars and the US dollar is no longer the currency of record in those areas, because there's a lot of pressure the Chinese are applying to have countries, adopt their currency, then you could end up with something that's enumerated in something that doesn't translate well to dollars if this is where you're going to end up.
Yeah, spot on, Doug. Well, cheers. Well, it's definitely a Thanksgiving week over here, starting to launch First in Coastal. So first, Doug, thank you for a brilliant presentation once again. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me. And I have to say, I don't even know how to. I'll stay on a little bit. So if anybody wants to send me a private note, I guess you can post it in the chat and then I will get back to you. The other is, if you just want to call me and talk to me, my phone number is area code 626-588-7598. And my email is d.huberman, H-U-B as in boy, E-R-M-A-N, at Lexington, PMC, that's Papa Mary Charlie.com.
And feel free, Doug, to type it on the chat as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll put my contact information into the chat right now.
Just in case, so they can have it. So that was Doug Huberman with Lexington Public Management and entrepreneur and professor of economics. And we're going to have more of Doug in the future, right, to hear and learn more. And of course, if you guys have any property referrals for his company, or want to get any kind of advice from him on any possible topic, even if you're not sure if he's the guy, reach out, and the information is in the chat. What I have everybody here as well, and I'm going to do this for a second.